Before you read this, ask yourself one thing. If you found the very creatures that had haunted your worst nights lying broken in the snow, too weak to bare their teeth, would your hands reach out to save them, or would you turn your horse around and let the cold finish what someone else had started? I thought I knew my answer. I was 71 years old and I thought I knew every last thing about myself. I was wrong about all of it. What happened on that ridge over the next 11 days rearranged something in me that I'd spent a lifetime keeping bolted down. This is the part nobody in town believes. It's also the only part that's true. The first thing I noticed was the silence. And silence up on Cold Fork Ridge in February is never a good sign. I'd been riding fence lines since before the light came up proper, my breath freezing into my collar, my old gelding Amos picking his way over ground that crunched like broken glass under his hooves. There's a certain quiet that means the world is asleep and a different quiet that means something has died in it. I've spent 53 winters learning to tell them apart. This was the second kind, thick, waiting, the kind that presses against your ears. I almost rode past them. That's the thing I keep coming back to, lying awake now. I almost rode straight past. If Amos hadn't stopped, if that stubborn animal hadn't planted all four legs and refused to take another step, ears pinned flat against his skull, nostrils flaring wide enough to catch the smell of something I couldn't, I would have kept going. I'd have finished the fence line, ridden home, warmed my hands on the stove, and never known. Sometimes I think about the man I'd still be if Amos had just kept walking. He'd be an easier man to live with, that one. But he'd be smaller too, and he'd never know it. "What is it, you old fool?" I muttered, and my voice sounded too loud in all that stillness. Then I looked down the slope and I saw them. 5 shapes in the snow, gray on white, curled and scattered along the bottom of a shallow draw where the wind had scoured the drifts thin. At first my mind refused them, told me they were rocks or a fallen log or shadows. But shadows don't have ribs that heave. Shadows don't lift a head an inch off the ground and let it fall again because even that costs too much. Wolves. My whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. You have to understand what wolves meant to me, to all of us up here. My father lost 11 head of cattle to a pack the winter I turned 9. And I remember him sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, not drinking it, just staring, because those 11 head were the difference between making the mortgage and not. I remember the sound my mother made when he told her the number. I grew up hating wolves the way you hate a thing you were taught to hate before you were old enough to choose. It was in my blood. It was practically a commandment. A good rancher shoots wolves. A good rancher doesn't think twice. And here were 5 of them, dying at the bottom of a draw, and every instinct my father ever planted in me said the same simple thing. Let them die. It's what they do to you. I sat on my horse a long time, longer than I'm proud of. The wind came up and rattled the dead branches of a lightning-split pine, and one of the wolves, the biggest, a scarred old male with a hide the color of wood smoke, turned his head and looked at me, not with fear, not with challenge, with something I wasn't ready for. He just looked at me, the way a man looks at another man across a great distance, both of them too tired to pretend anymore. His eyes were amber and clouded and utterly without hope. He'd already decided how this ended. He was only watching to see whether I'd be the one to do it, or whether the cold would beat me to it. Something in my chest cracked right down the middle. I've tried in the 2 years since to describe to people what that look did to me, and I always come up short. The closest I've gotten is this. I once sat with my father while he died. 1978, a bad heart, 3 days in a hospital bed in the county seat. And near the end, when he was past speaking, he looked at me across the rail of that bed with exactly the same expression. Not asking to be saved, because he knew better, but simply seeing me, taking me in one last time, letting me be the last face. The scarred old wolf looked at me the way my dying father looked at me. And I was 50 years old again in a hospital that smelled of bleach, and I was 9 years old listening to my mother do arithmetic over 11 dead cattle, and I was 71 on a frozen ridge. All at once, all the ages I'd ever been stacked up inside me like cordwood, and every one of them was looking back into those amber eyes. I want to tell you I made a noble decision. I didn't. I didn't decide anything. My legs just swung me down off Amos before my brain had voted on the matter, and my boots hit the snow, and I stood there in the freezing dawn with my heart hammering and absolutely no plan in the world. Easy, I said, though I don't know who I was talking to, them or myself. Easy now. Up close it was worse. They were starving. That was the plain fact of it, written in every jutting bone and sunken flank. The scarred male, 3 others, 2 younger, leaner, one of them limping even where it lay and off to the side, half buried, so small I'd taken it for a stone, a pup. Not a newborn, maybe 8, 9 months. Old enough to travel, young enough that its bones still looked too big for it. It wasn't moving at all. For a second I was sure it was already gone, and I felt a grief so sudden and so out of proportion that it embarrassed me. Then its side rose, just barely, fell, rose again. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. There was something wrong with all of them beyond the hunger. I crouched slow, so slow, keeping my hands where they could see, and I saw it. Their muzzles, their paws, crusted with something dark and wrong, the fur worn away, the skin beneath cracked and weeping, and around the neck of the scarred male, half grown into the flesh, a loop of rusted wire. A snare. Somebody had strung snares along this draw, God knows how long ago, and this pack had blundered into a whole line of them. The old male had torn himself loose but left the wire behind, buried in his own neck, and the wound had gone bad. The others, I pieced it together slow, the way you piece together a wreck. The others had stayed. That was the thing that undid me. They could have moved on. A hungry wolf doesn't linger for a dying one. That's not how the wild does its arithmetic. But they'd stayed with him. Circled back, bedded down beside the one who couldn't run, and slowly, one by one, starved in the staying. I've known men who wouldn't do that for their own brothers. I knelt there in the snow between the fence I was paid to mend, and 5 animals I was raised to kill, and I felt the whole architecture of my certainty come loose from its moorings. "All right," I heard myself say. "All right, all right." Saying it 3 times didn't make it any more all right, but it got me moving. The ride back to the ranch is 40 minutes at a walk. I did it in 25, and I don't think I breathed for most of it, my mind spinning out plans and discarding them, each one more foolish than the last. What did I think I was going to do? Nurse a wolf pack back to health? At my age, alone, with a bad hip and a spread I could barely keep running as it was. The whole thing was madness. Anyone with sense would have gone home, called the county, let somebody with a rifle and a permit handle it clean. I didn't call the county. I told myself it was because they'd take too long, and there was truth in that. But the deeper truth, the one I only found later in the dark, when a man can't lie to himself as easily, was that I couldn't stand the thought of that old male's amber eyes going out because I'd made a phone call. If they were going to die, I'd decided somewhere on that frozen ride, they weren't going to die alone in a ditch the way my whole life had taught me they deserved to. I don't know when I decided it. I only know that by the time I clattered into the barnyard, it was decided, bone deep, and no argument I could muster would shake it. I loaded the sled I use for hauling feed, threw on every blanket and horse rug I owned, filled a jug with warm water, and grabbed the big thermos and a sack of the raw scraps I keep for the dogs, wire cutters, my good knife, a bottle of the antiseptic I use on the cattle, and a fistful of clean rags. The whole time my hands were shaking, and I told myself it was the cold. My wife would have known what to do. Della had a way with hurt things, birds, barn cats, once a fawn whose mother a truck had killed on the county road. She'd have taken one look at those 5 wolves and rolled up her sleeves without a flicker of doubt. Della's been gone 4 years now. Cancer fast, the kind that doesn't give you time to get used to the idea. And I'll tell you something I've never told a living soul. As I was loading that sled, hurrying, fumbling, half out of my mind, I felt her at my shoulder for the first time since the funeral. Not a ghost, nothing so simple. Just a certainty, warm at my back, that I was doing the thing she'd have wanted me to do. That maybe I'd been sleepwalking through 4 years of a half-lived life, and something out on that ridge had finally reached in and shaken me awake. I'm not a man who cries easy. I cried a little, loading that sled. Then I wiped my face on my sleeve and got Amos back in his traces and headed for the ridge. The pup was the one I went at first. I don't fully know why. The old male was the leader, the one whose eyes had hooked me, and the wire around his neck was the most urgent wound. But it was the pup I crawled to first, dragging a blanket across the snow, my breath sawing in and out. Maybe because it was smallest. Maybe because a thing that young dying seemed the most unbearable arithmetic of all. Maybe because saving the pup felt possible in a way that saving the whole broken pack did not, and a frightened old man will reach for the possible thing. It didn't fight me. That should have relieved me. It terrified me instead, because a wolf that doesn't fight is a wolf that's given up, and giving up is the last door before the last door. I wrapped it, whole body, just its nose sticking out, and I lifted it. It weighed almost nothing, 30 pounds where it should have been 60, and I held it against my chest inside my coat, and I felt its heart going quick and thready against my own, and I said, out loud in the empty white morning, "Not today. You hear me? Not today." The old male watched me the entire time. I'd braced for him to lunge when I touched the pup. Injured or not, a wolf protecting its young is 150 pounds of teeth and fury, and I'd half expected to lose a hand. But he didn't move. He just watched, those amber eyes tracking me, and slowly, so slowly I almost missed it, the tension went out of his shoulders, as though he'd been holding on to the last of his strength for exactly this. As though he'd been waiting, in whatever way a wolf can wait, for someone to come and take the load off him. When he saw me wrap the pup, when he understood, I swear to you, that I meant it no harm, he let his head sink back into the snow and closed his eyes. He trusted me. Do you know what that does to a man? To be trusted, absolutely, by the very thing you were raised to be the enemy of. I've turned it over 10,000 times since, and I still can't find the bottom of it. All I know is that in that moment, kneeling in the snow with a starving pup against my heart, and a dying wolf laying his life in my hands, every wall I'd built in 71 years came down at once, and I was just a creature among other creatures, all of us cold, all of us afraid, all of us trying to get to morning. Getting 5 wolves onto a sled by yourself, when 4 of them can barely lift their heads, and one of them still has a snare wire strangling him from the inside, is not a thing they teach you on a ranch. I did it wrong, probably. I did it slow. I did it with a running monologue of nonsense. Easy now, there you go, that's it, nobody's hurting you, easy. Because the sound of a voice, any voice, seemed to keep them from panicking, and truth be told, it kept me from panicking too. The 2 younger ones I could half lift, half drag onto the blankets. The limping one snapped at me once. A reflex, teeth clicking shut on empty air an inch from my wrist, and I froze and waited and started talking again, softer, and after a minute it let me touch it. The old male I saved for last, because he was the hardest, and because I was afraid. That wire had to come off. There was no way around it. It had cut deep into the muscle of his neck, and the flesh around it was hot and swollen and stinking, and if I loaded him without dealing with it, I'd just be hauling him home to die slower. So I knelt in front of a wild wolf, a thing that could open my throat in half a second, and I took out my wire cutters and I looked into his amber eyes and I said, "This is going to hurt. I'm sorry. I need you to hold still. Can you do that for me?" He held still. I will go to my grave swearing that he understood me, not the words, the intent. He held perfectly, terribly still while I worked the point of my knife under the wire, while I cut it, while I eased the rusted loop out of his flesh a fraction of an inch at a time, and he trembled all over, and a low sound came out of him that wasn't a growl and wasn't a whimper, but something in the awful country between them. Blood welled up dark. I packed it with antiseptic and rag in my own bare shaking hands, and the whole time he held still, and the whole time he watched me, and when it was done, when the wire was finally out and lying in the red snow like the small dead evil it was, he did a thing I have no explanation for. He touched his nose to my hand. Just once, just for a second, cold and dry and gentle, and then he let me lift him onto the sled with the others, all 5 of them together now, wrapped and breathing and alive, and I stood there over that ridge in the rising light with the wire in my pocket and blood on my hands and tears freezing on my face, and I thought, I have no idea what I've done. I have no idea what happens now. I still didn't, not the half of it. Getting them home was its own kind of ordeal, one I hadn't thought through in the fever of loading them. The sled was heavy now, heavier than a load of feed, and the trail back wound down off the ridge through a stand of pines where the snow lay deep and untracked. Amos labored. I walked beside him most of the way, one hand on the traces, the other resting on the blanketed shapes to feel for the rise and fall of breath, and every few hundred yards I'd call a halt and go down the line, wolf by wolf, pressing my palm to each flank, counting the ones still with me. 4, 5, still 5. I kept a running tally in my head like a man saying a rosary, and each time I got to 5 my chest loosened a notch. Halfway down, the limping one seized. I don't know a better word for it. Its whole body went rigid under the blanket and then began to shake, a hard, rhythmic shudder, and a sound came out of it I'd never heard an animal make, high and thin and awful. I thought I was losing it. I dropped to my knees in the snow beside the sled and did the only thing I knew to do, which was to lie my body along its body, weight and warmth, the way you'd hold a child through a nightmare. And I talked, God, I don't even remember what I said, nonsense, the words to an old song Della used to hum while she cooked, the names of my cattle, anything, and slowly, the shaking eased. Later Doc would tell me it was likely the cold and the shock and the body simply running out of fuel to keep itself running. At the time I thought it was dying in my arms, and I made a sound of my own, kneeling there in the snow, that I'm glad no living soul was near enough to hear. It didn't die. Its breathing steadied, and when I finally stood up, shaking, and looked at the 4 others, every one of them had its eyes open and fixed on me, watching, as though they were taking my measure the way the old male had, deciding something, as though they'd seen what I did for the sick one and were revising, in whatever way a wolf revises, some ancient and hard-won belief about what a man on 2 legs was for. I got back to my feet and took up the traces again. Come on, Amos, I said, let's get everybody home. The lambing shed hadn't held a lamb in 15 years, but it was tight and dry, and I'd kept the insulation up out of habit, and it turned out to be exactly the thing. I bedded it deep with clean straw, ran a line from the house so I could put a heat lamp in the far corner, low and safe, throwing a red glow that took the killing edge off the cold. I carried the wolves in one at a time and laid them out on the straw not far from each other because they seemed to want it, seemed to settle when they could feel one another close, and I barred the door and stood in that red-lit warmth listening to 5 sets of lungs working, in and out in the dark. Then I started the broth. I'd read somewhere, or maybe Della told me, half my knowledge is really hers, that a starving body can't take real food right off, that it'll kill them faster than the hunger did, something about the shock of it. So it was broth. Warm, thin, salted a little. I made a great pot of it from the beef bones I keep for the dogs, and I let it cool to blood warm. And then I knelt in the straw with a dish and a spoon, and began the long, slow work of coaxing life back into things that had nearly let go of it. The pup took it first. That's a picture I'll keep till I die. The smallest of them lifting its head off the straw, its whole body trembling with the effort and its rough pink tongue coming out to touch the broth once, testing, and then again and again, weak little laps, and me kneeling over it in the red light whispering, that's it, good, that's it, like it was the most important thing that had ever happened. Which right then it was. One by one the others took it too, all except the old male who turned his head away, and whose breathing I noticed with a cold drop in my stomach had begun to change. Faster, wetter. I dribbled broth past his teeth anyway, a little at a time, and he swallowed it because I made him. But there was no want in it, no fight, and I knelt there in the small hours with my hand on his fevered skull, and I understood that the wire had done its work deeper than I'd been able to reach. By dawn, all 5 were still with me. I told myself that was the hard part done. I have never in my life been so wrong about anything. The trouble started the second night. I'd made it home, the ride back an agony of stopping every few minutes to check they were still breathing, to tuck a slipped blanket back over a bony flank. I'd bedded them down in the old lambing shed, the one with the good insulation and the door I could bar, and I'd sat up with them through the first night feeding warm broth into them a spoonful at a time, dribbling it past their teeth, coaxing, begging. By dawn, all 5 were still with me. The pup had lifted its head on its own and lapped weakly at the broth from a dish, and I'd wept again over that small victory like a damned fool. But the second night, the fever came for the old male. I'd cleaned the wound as best I knew, but I'm not a vet, and the infection had gotten too deep a hold before I ever found him. By dark he was burning up, shaking, his breath coming in wet ragged pulls, and I knew, I've watched enough animals die to know, that he was slipping away from me. The other 4 seemed to know it too. They dragged themselves across the shed, all 4 of them, to lie pressed against him. The same terrible loyalty that had nearly killed the whole pack out on the ridge now turned toward keeping him warm, toward keeping him here. And I made a decision that night that I'm still not sure was mine to make. I called Doc Rays, old friend, retired veterinarian, the only person on this earth I trusted with a secret this size. Woke him at 2 in the morning, told him everything. There was a long silence on the line, and then he said the words I'll never forget. "Frank, you know what you're asking me to do. You're asking me to help you save a wolf. Do you understand what that costs a man like me if it goes wrong, if it gets out?" And I said, "I know exactly what it costs. I'm asking anyway." Another silence. Then, "I'll be there in 40 minutes, put coffee on." The snow was coming down hard by the time his headlights swung into the yard. He came. Of course he came. But what he told me when he'd finished working over that old wolf by lantern light, what he made me promise before he'd drive back home through the storm, that's where this stops being a story about 5 dying animals and starts being a story about the 2 of us, and the town, and a choice that was going to cost me almost everything I had left. I didn't know it yet. Standing in that freezing shed at 3 in the morning with my hand on a wolf's fevered flank and my oldest friend rolling up his sleeves beside me, I thought the hard part was behind me. The hard part hadn't even started. I held the light and I held the wolf and I did whatever Doc told me, and somewhere around 4 in the morning he sat back on his heels, wiped his forehead with the back of a bloody wrist and said, "The infection's in the blood now. Septic. I've drained what I can and dosed him heavy, but Frank, I want you to hear me, this is a coin toss. Maybe worse than a coin toss. If he makes it through tonight, he's got a chance. If he doesn't, he didn't finish. He didn't have to." "What do I do?" I said. "You keep him warm, you keep him hydrated, you sit with him." He started packing his bag, his hands slower than they'd been 30 years ago when he was the best vet in 3 counties. "And you pray if you're a praying man. I never took you for one." "I wasn't," I said. "Lately I'm reconsidering." He almost smiled. Then he did a thing I didn't expect. Instead of packing the last of his bag and heading for the door, he pulled up the second feed bucket, the one I'd been meaning to fix, and he sat down on it beside me in the lantern light and he said, "I'll stay a couple hours, see if he turns." He rubbed his hands together against the cold. "Truth is, Frank, I haven't had my hands in real work like this since I sold the practice. Retirement's a slow way to die. This is the most alive I've felt in a year, and I'll thank you not to tell my wife I said so." So we sat, 2 old men on 2 feed buckets in a lambing shed at the black bottom of a February night, a fevered wolf between us, and we talked the way men our age don't often let ourselves talk, about our wives both gone, about the boys we'd been. About the way the whole country we'd grown up in had changed under us, the ranches sold off, the young folks moved to the cities, the old certainties. About land, about wolves, about what a life was for, coming loose one after another until you looked up one day and hardly recognized the world you'd woke into. And Doc looked at the wolf and said, "Quiet. You know why I came, really. It wasn't the medicine. You could have let it die and I'd not have blamed you." He was quiet a moment. "It's that in 40 years of doctoring animals, I never once got to do a thing that didn't make sense. Everything had a reason. Economics. This," he gestured at the wolf, at the shed, at the whole impossible situation. "This doesn't make a lick of sense, Frank. And I think I've been waiting my whole life to do one thing that didn't." I didn't have an answer for that. But I reached over and gripped his shoulder, and he gripped my arm back, and we sat there till the fever broke. Then his face went serious in a way I didn't like. "Frank, somebody's going to find out, you know that. You can't keep 5 wolves in a shed a quarter-mile from the county road and expect it to stay quiet. And when it gets out," he shook his head, "half this town lost stock to wolves. The Hendersons lost their whole flock 2 winters back. Ray Cobble's still paying off the loan he took to restock. These people don't hate wolves the way you used to hate wolves. They hate them worse because it costs them more recent. You start being known as the man who saves them." He let it hang. "I'm not saying don't do it. I drove out here at 2 in the morning, didn't I? I'm saying know what you're spending, because you're going to spend it whether you meant to or not." I did know. I'd known since the ridge. But hearing it said out loud, in Doc's tired, steady voice, made it real in a way it hadn't been. And I stood in that shed after his taillights disappeared into the snow, and I understood that I'd just traded my standing in the only place I'd ever lived for the lives of 5 animals who'd never know the price of them. The old male made it through the night. I know because I never left his side. I sat on an overturned feed bucket with his fevered head in my lap, and I talked to him until my voice gave out. Told him about Della, about my father and the 11 dead cattle, about the boy I'd been who'd have shot him without a second thought, about the man I was becoming who couldn't and didn't want to anymore. I don't know if it helped him. I know it helped me. And when the gray light finally came seeping under the shed door and I felt his breathing ease, felt the fire go out of his skin, felt him sink into the first real sleep he'd had since I found him, I put my face down against his neck, right next to the wound, right where the wire had been, and I let go of something I'd been carrying since a funeral 4 years back, and I don't have the words for what that was, so I won't try. They called it a miracle in town later once they knew. They didn't mean it kindly. Word got out the way word always gets out in a place like this, slow, then all at once. It was the pup that did it in the end. By the 3rd week the pup was strong enough to be a nuisance, and one bright cold afternoon it slipped out the shed door I'd left cracked and went bounding across the yard, all legs and joy, chasing nothing, being young, being alive. And Wendell Struthers happened to be driving past on the county road with his grandson, and he saw it, and he knew a wolf when he saw one. And by supper the whole valley knew that old Frank Dietrich had gone soft in the head, and was raising wolves out on the Dietrich place. The first truck showed up the next morning. Ray Cobble, the man Doc had mentioned, still paying off the loan on his restocked herd. He didn't get out of the truck at first, just sat in the yard with the engine running, and I came out onto the porch with my coffee, and we looked at each other across 40 feet of frozen mud, 2 old men who'd known each other 60 years, who'd gone to the same school and buried our wives in the same cemetery, and I saw in his face that he'd come here angry, and that underneath the anger was something more like betrayal. "Is it true?" he said finally out the window. "It's true." He got out then, slow. He walked halfway to the porch and stopped. "My daddy homesteaded that land the same year yours did, Frank. I've lost. Do you know how much I've lost to those animals? Do you have any idea? And you're up here feeding them, nursing them like they're—" His voice broke and he stopped, furious at himself for it. "My wife used to make me coffee in the morning, just like that cup you're holding. Nell, God rest her. And I'd go out and half my mornings there'd be a new carcass in the field, throat torn out, and I'd have to come back in and tell her, and watch her do the math on our lives, Same as your mama did, same as everybody's. And you're feeding them. I set my coffee down on the porch rail. My hands weren't steady. I said. There were 5 of them dying in a ditch. One of them was a pup. They'd walked into a snare line and the leader tore himself loose and the rest of them stayed with him rather than leave him to die alone. I heard my own voice shake and I let it. I've watched men leave each other for less. I've done it myself. And I looked at those animals staying with their dying brother in the cold and I couldn't. Now it was my turn to stop. I'm not asking you to understand it. I don't fully understand it. I'm telling you I couldn't ride past. That's all, I couldn't ride past. Ray Cowboy looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked past me at the shed, where the old male had come to the doorway and stood watching us both with those amber eyes, calm and unafraid. The wound on his neck healed now to a puckered pink scar. Something moved across Ray's face that I couldn't read. My grandson wants to see them, he said at last, quiet. Little Tommy, he heard Wendell talking. He's been asking all night. A pause. I told him no. I told him they were killers and I'd not have him near them. He swallowed. But he asked me why you'd save a killer and I didn't have an answer for him, Frank. 60 years I've had an answer for everything and I didn't have one for that. I didn't say anything. Some silences you don't fill. Not today, Ray said finally, getting back in his truck. But maybe, he shook his head like a man arguing with himself and losing. I don't know, maybe I'll bring him by, maybe I won't. He put the truck in reverse. Then he stopped and looked at me one more time and said something I've thought about every day since. The thing that gets me, Frank, the thing I can't get past is that they stayed. With the dying one, you said that and I can't. His jaw worked. Nell stayed with me, through everything. And when she was going, at the end, I sat with her every night and I never once left, and folks said I was a good man for it. He looked at the wolf in the doorway. And now you're telling me those animals did the same thing I did. The same exact thing, and I called them killers. He drove off before I could answer, which was just as well because I didn't have one. He came back though, that's the part I hold on to. It was a week later, a Saturday, and I heard the truck before I saw it and my stomach tightened the way it did every time now, braced for another note, another turn back. But when Ray climbed out, he wasn't alone. The boy was with him, Tommy, 7 years old, clutching his grandfather's hand and staring at the shed with eyes the size of saucers. Ray stood in the yard and didn't quite meet my eyes and said, gruff. He wouldn't let it rest. Asked me every day. And I got to thinking, he stopped, started over. I got to thinking maybe it's worse for a boy to grow up hating a thing he's never looked in the eye. Maybe that's how it starts, the hating. So, he nudged the boy forward an inch. Show him. But you keep him safe, Frank. I took them into the shed slow, and I made the boy stand still and quiet by the door while the wolves took his scent. And the old male, the leader, the one with the scar, rose up off the straw and crossed the shed and stood in front of that child, and Tommy went absolutely rigid, and I saw Ray's hand twitch toward him. But the wolf just lowered its great gray head and looked at the boy, level, calm, the way it had once looked at me on the ridge. And Tommy, who did not know he wasn't supposed to, reached out one small hand and laid it flat on the wolf's shoulder. I heard Ray's breath catch behind me. The boy stood there with his hand on a wolf, and the wolf let him, and something passed between them that I will not insult by trying to explain. And when Tommy finally turned around, his face was wet and shining, and he said, in a whisper, Grandpa, he's not a killer. He just had a really hard life. And Ray Cowboy, who had lost half his herd and half his savings to animals like this one, who had buried his Nell and called these creatures the enemy his whole long life, put both hands over his face and wept in the doorway of my lambing shed, and I put my arm around him, and the boy stood there with his hand on the wolf, and none of us said anything at all. That was the day the town's mind began to turn, though it took months more. Tommy told the story at school. Children told their parents, and it's a curious thing, but a hard old belief that can stand up to any amount of argument from a grown man will sometimes come apart entirely at one sentence from a child with his hand on a wolf's shoulder. Not everyone was Ray. I want to be honest about that because it would make a prettier story to say the whole town came around, one heart at a time, and learned to love what they'd feared. That's not what happened. Some folks never forgave me. The Hendersons crossed the street from me at the feed store for the better part of a year. Somebody left a note in my mailbox, no signature, block letters, that said things I won't repeat about Della, about what she'd think, and that one cut deep because they'd used the one name that could cut me. There were nights I sat in my kitchen and wondered if I'd traded a whole life's worth of belonging for a decision I'd made in 11 cold minutes on a ridge. There were nights the answer felt like yes, and those were bad nights. I'll tell you about the worst of them, because I've never been able to leave it out when I tell this straight. It was March, still winter's teeth in it, and I'd had a day where everything went wrong at once. The truck wouldn't start, a water line froze and burst in the barn, and at the feed store Alma Henderson had turned her cart around in the aisle rather than pass me, right in front of a dozen people, so that everyone would see her do it. I came home in the dark, tired all the way to the bone, tired in the place where a man keeps his reasons for going on, and I sat at my kitchen table, Della's table, the one where my mother's arithmetic and Nell Cobble's arithmetic and every rancher's wife's arithmetic had been done for 100 years. And I put my head in my hands and I asked out loud, to the empty house, whether I'd thrown my life away. And then I heard it, faint, through the walls from the shed. The old male, well enough now to lift his voice, had begun to howl, low and long and rising, that sound that had frightened my whole line of forefathers, that had meant ruin to us for 100 years. But sitting there in my dark kitchen at the bottom of my worst night, it didn't sound like ruin. It sounded like company. It sounded like the only other creature awake in the whole frozen valley calling out into the dark just to say, "Still here, still here, are you still here?" And I lifted my head, and I found I was not alone in the house of my grief the way I'd been alone in it for 4 years. And something in me that had been ready to lie down and quit stood back up instead. I went out to the shed, sat with them a while in the red light, and when I came back in, the question that had seemed so heavy, did I throw my life away, had quietly answered itself, and the answer was no, and I slept that night like I hadn't slept since Della passed. But here is the thing about the wolves. They healed, all 5 of them. The pup grew into a rangy, beautiful, half-wild thing that would eat from my hand and then look at the tree line with a longing I understood completely, because it's the same longing I feel every spring when the geese go over. The 2 younger ones filled out and grew strong and restless. The limping one's leg knit crooked but sound. And the old male, my old male, the one whose amber eyes had reached into me and pulled me off my horse, he became something I have no word for. Not a pet. Never that. But not wild anymore either, not entirely. He'd taken my measure out on that ridge, and he'd made some decision about me the way I'd made one about him, and whatever passed between us in the cutting of that wire held all the way through. Doc said I had to release them, come spring, when they were strong. "You can't keep wolves, Frank," he told me, gently, the way you tell a man a thing he already knows and doesn't want to. "It's not fair to them, and it's not legal, and it's not safe. They're not yours. They were never yours. You didn't save them to own them. You saved them so they could go back to being what they are." He was right. I knew he was right. It didn't make it easier. We let them go on a morning in late April, when the snow had pulled back into the shadows, and the aspens were budding out, and the whole valley smelled of thaw and mud and beginning. Doc came, and Ray came, Ray of all people, standing off to one side with his hands jammed in his pockets, having driven out at dawn without quite being able to say why, the way I'd loaded that sled without quite being able to say why, all those months ago. And his grandson Tommy came, 7 years old and vibrating with the enormity of it, having finally worn his grandfather down. The boy stood at the edge of the yard and watched those 5 wolves come out of the shed into the free morning, and I heard him whisper, "They're so beautiful," and I saw Ray Cobble put a hand on the boy's shoulder and not say anything at all. The 4 younger ones went fast. That's how it should be. The pup, not a pup anymore, a lean young wolf now, looked back at me once from the tree line, and then it was gone, folded into the green, and I felt the tearing loose of it in my chest, and I let myself feel it because Della taught me long ago that you don't get to keep the things you love. You only get to have loved them, and that has to be enough because it's all there is. I'd been afraid in the weeks before that letting them go would feel like losing, like a second funeral, and there was grief in it, I won't pretend otherwise. The shed would be empty tonight, and the red lamp dark, and the great pot of broth put away, and the mornings would go quiet again. But standing there watching those animals I'd carried off a ridge in pieces run whole and strong into the free green world, I found the grief was shot all through with something else, something I hadn't expected, and it took me a moment to name it because I'd been so long without it. It was joy. Plain, uncomplicated joy, the kind a child feels and a grown man mostly forgets how to. They were alive. They were free. I had done that. Whatever it had cost me in the eyes of the town, whatever I'd traded, I had knelt in the snow and pulled a rusted wire out of a dying thing's neck. And now that thing was running under the aspens in the April light, and no note in my mailbox and no cart turned around in an aisle could take that back or make it small. The old mail was the last to go. He walked to the edge of the yard and stopped, and he turned around, and he looked at me across the space between us the same way he'd looked at me on the ridge in February, both of us too old and too worn for pretending, and I understood that he was saying goodbye in the only language either of us had ever really needed. I didn't move toward him. You don't. But I lifted my hand. I don't know why, it just came up. And I held it out open, the way you'd hold it out to an old friend across a room you're both leaving. And he touched his nose to the air in my direction, once, the way he'd touched my hand on the ridge. Then he turned and walked into the trees, and I never saw him again. That was 2 years ago. Ray Cobble and I have coffee most mornings now, at his place or mine. Tommy comes by in the summers and asks me to tell the wolf story over and over, and I do, and I never tell it the same way twice, because the truth of a thing that big can't be caught in just one telling. Some of the town forgave me and some never will, and I've made my peace with the arithmetic of that mostly, on the good days. I still ride the fence line on Cold Fork Ridge. Every February I stop at the draw where I found them, and I sit on my horse a while in the silence, the second kind of silence, the waiting kind, and I think about the man I'd still be if Amos had just kept walking that morning. Easier to live with, that man. Smaller, too. And he'd never have known what I know now, which is this. Twice in the last 2 winters, riding that ridge in the blue dawn, I've seen a shape in the tree line. Gray on white. Too big for a coyote. Standing still, watching, keeping its distance, as a wild thing should. And once, just once, the wind carried something across the snow to me, low and long and rising, and I sat there with my breath freezing in my collar and my heart going like a young man's, and I answered it the only way I know how. I lifted my hand,